Welcome to today's event, The Future of the World, Forecasting and the U.S. Intelligence Community, part of Perry House's Global Order Colloquium. Today, we are delighted to welcome Morgan Muir, the United States Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Mission Integration. In addition to his role as Deputy Director of National Intelligence for Mission Integration, Muir has served in a variety of senior executive intelligence and policy roles. His most recent assignments include working overseas with a foreign partner, serving as the Assistant Director of CIA for Near East Affairs. He previously worked for 3 years in the Directorate of Analysis front office, rising to be the Deputy Director of Analysis. Muir has also previously served as Deputy Director of the CIA's Counterterrorism Center, and prior to that, head of its analytic arm, the Office of Terrorism Analysis. In CTC, he led officers at the heart of the fight against Al-Qaeda and its allies, helping inform and shape US policy. He also was involved in almost regular daily intelligence briefings for President George W. Bush. Thank you, Mr. Muir, for taking the time to join us today for this important conversation. Our moderator today will be Perry House's own Michael Horowitz, the Richard Perry Professor and Director of Perry House. He's the author of The Diffusion of Military Power, Causes and Consequences for International Politics, and co-author of Why Leaders Fight. His research interests include the intersection of emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence and robotics with global politics, military innovation, the role of leaders in international politics, and geopolitical forecasting methodology. He is a senior fellow at a little-known place called the Council on Foreign Relations. Before I turn the virtual stage to our speakers, I'd like to take a moment to thank the generous supporters of the Global Order Colloquium, including Carnegie Corporation of New York, the Elliott and Harriet Goldstein Private Foundation, and Jesse Friedlander, as well as, of course, Paratosh Thakur and Hamal Mirani. Thank you for your support of Perry House, and thanks again to you, the audience, for tuning in for this exciting event. Mike and Mr. Muir, the floor is yours.
Hi. Well, in thinking about, my few opening remarks, I think we have framed it as what the intelligence community does is assess key trends and uncertainties that shape the strategic environment with the goal of trying to inform policymakers about both tactical near-term events, medium-term developments to give them a sense of what it is they need to be focused on and how they can shape the outcome that they're seeing, or at least affect it, and as well as the longer-term trends to give a sense of the direction the world is going, the challenges that are coming up, and again, with an eye toward what are the longer-term things they need to be able to do to build coalitions, shift policies, to create space to advance American national security interests, to advance, to deal with some of the challenges that the world faces. In doing all of these things, we focus on what is it we assess, how confident are we in this, why do we think what we think, what are the gaps, what are the anomalies we're seeing that could affect the analytic line, how to capture that uncertainty in any piece as we talk about opportunities. In doing that, we rely on a range of product. We have both qualitative and quantitative methods that we use. Partly we just, engage, all the collection the intelligence community has. We worked with outreach to experts in the field, in the academic community certainly, and abroad. We employ a lot of structured analytic techniques designed to challenge the assumptions we have, or at least to understand what are the key linchpins of our analytic approach. What are the things, if they change, would have a demonstrable impact on the analytic lines that we take. We engage on quantitative methods, models, simulations, tabletop exercises that draw upon some of these same tools, et cetera, to help people think about the choices and the risks and the uncertainties as one moves ahead. For most of our time with the policy side, it's, they are looking at a challenge and want to figure out how do we get to a better outcome than we seem to be heading towards. And so part and parcel of what we attempt to do is try to lay out where we're headed, here are the options, here are the risks, here's how you should think about some of these issues. I think moving forward, I think over the last several years, we've understood that the need to figure out better ways to use the data that we have. One of the huge challenges that is that as the data has exploded, whether in the open source, in the collection realm, et cetera, how do you capture all of it? How do you make certain that as you're drafting these assessments, you have a feel for anything that's relevant out there, anything that's relevant over the last 5 years, other people that have asked the same questions, what other questions have they asked when they've gone through this? And so part of there is a technological shift in how we go about data mining, et cetera. The other thing that I think we're open to is methods, technologies that can help bound discussions of the future with improved accuracy. And we look forward to the discussion today, and certainly the discussion over the course of this conference in looking at it. As some of the read-ahead papers indicated, at a foundational level, the IC has sponsored work on crowdsourced forecasting and how to improve the forecasting acumen of analysts. In particular, we have focused on how super forecasters develop and adjust the point predictions and how these contribute to the assessments on broader issues. We are exploring right now efforts to move along these paths. We're incorporating some of the insights that we've gotten from years past and in the academic literature now into a new crowdsourced forecasting tool designed to be inclusive, open, and responsive to both analyst and policymaker desire for transparency and relevance. The NIC has established a new position focused on forecasting, and I know that CIA is planning a new forecasting workshop focused on probabilistic thinking methods. In addition, the IC's move to the cloud has allowed for a more technical infrastructure there to pursue efforts to how do we augment human analysis with expert judgment with machine learning, allowing us to make better sense of the data that we have as well as sort of the modeling that's going on. The key thing, and the last point that I'll make though, is all of these efforts, the tools have to work for the analysts and they have to better serve the policymakers. We need to figure out how to demonstrate to the analysts and to the policymakers the benefits of blending machine-based analysis with expertise and ways that can address anomalies, inconsistencies, and uncertainties, and deliver that insight at speed. Because in so much of the work that we do, you're sitting in the room and there's a question and you need to have the answer that day or the next day, et cetera. And it's making the entire system work and being able to deliver that sort of insight it remains a critical challenge for us. So I think with that, I will turn it over to Professor Horowitz.
Thank you, sir, for joining us today, and thanks for those introductory remarks. And I'm going to ask you a few questions, and then we'll turn it over to audience questions. And as a reminder, if you want to ask a question from the audience, please use the Q&A button in the middle of the Zoom interface, and I will select questions from there, and we'll be off. And so thank you again, sir, for those insights. And I guess why don't we start with ODNI's, I think, most prominent public output in some ways, which I think is the Global Trends Report. I mean, maybe I'm probably biased as an academic in some ways that I read it, but the latest Global Trends Report was called a More Contested World. And I was wondering if you could maybe take a minute and tell our audience a bit about the insights of this report and how you think about, you mentioned a lot of different sources of information. How do you put those together in something like a Global Trends Report?
Well, let me start with the back half first. These things tend to start a year out. We do them every 4 years, usually when a new administration comes into office, with an idea of looking out over 20 years. There's also an effort of looking back, figuring out sort of how did we do in years past, what trends did we miss, et cetera. And starting about a year out, we begin sitting down talking about what should the themes be, engagement with outside experts on how they see the world 20 years from now, what they see as the key trends and challenges. Then we begin to work in figuring out, can we get is the shape and the framing takes place, where do we need to delve more deeply? And so in this case, there was some work done, with some crowdsourced work, and with models, and with the focus there, though, when I talked to Maria, looking at how did they come to the conclusion that they did? I mean, a lot of times it's a challenge for us. We see the output, but understanding how we got there, what sort of drove it, et cetera, which is a critical part of what we're trying to explain in the 2040 or global trends pieces. Not just to say this is where we think we'll be in 20 years, but what are the drivers and what's the interplay? I mean, I think in the global trends piece this time, I mean, the key things, one, shared global challenges are becoming more frequent and intense. We've seen crossing borders, often without a direct human agent. Obviously, the pandemic is the most recent example there. Less explored, though, we think, it's tended to be how these challenges converge and interact. We see it in a place like Africa, where a youthful, growing, and urbanizing population that's connected by personal technology has significant exposure to climate change, but relatively low levels of institutional adaptive capacity. We think many aspects of the world are becoming increasingly fragmented. As the world has grown more connected with technology, trade, movement of people, that very connectivity is facilitating divisions between and among people and states. We see this playing out in societies splitting along the lines increasingly of identity, in the global trading system, as we talk about how to protect global supply chains, and a proliferation of regional and global trade initiatives. I think the scale of these global challenges and the implications of the fragmentation are exceeding the ability of existing institutions at all levels to respond to them, leading to some disequilibrium in the system. For example, we've seen a rise in protests against governments of every type in every region of the world over the last decade, suggesting rising expectations and widespread dissatisfaction with existing governing models. So how they adapt to be able to better deliver services for the people, I think will be one of the real challenges that we're looking at. And so we ended up with a key consequence of this disequilibrium being a greater contestation, not just in the international system, where we spent a lot of time talking about what we see in the 5 and 10 years ahead, but we also within states and societies themselves. This is not all negative, though. I mean, while when we talk about contestation, it conveys a sense of challenge and the like, and certainly it can be a source of instability. We do think rigorous and open debate, the contest of ideas, is the foundation of democracy and an opportunity for reforms and advancement. So the challenge is, how do you sort of look at sort of this and think about, if you're on the policy side, what does the next 20 years look at? What are the things I ought to be thinking about moving ahead? So.
Well, that's great. I mean, and the Global Trends Report obviously is looking far out, but most of the work the intelligence community does is much more short term. And while from a media perspective, often there's a focus on failure, of course, because that's what that's what people notice. I was wondering if you could maybe share with us what, from your perspective in thinking about, from a forecasting perspective in a way, what's an example or two of something that you think that the IC's gotten right that you can share with us?
The challenge is, I mean, it's less about getting things right, because what we want to be in a place is where, I mean, I would argue, I would like the IC to be in a place where they fail a lot. It's easy to write pieces where if you frame them broadly enough, it's impossible to be wrong in it. What I would like is that we frame pieces in ways that convey to the policy side a sense of opportunity and risk in some of these places, and we're not always going to be right in those locations. We're going to be looking at opportunities that prove to be ephemeral. We're going to be looking at opportunities that there's a 20% chance of it working, but if it worked, it would be a lot better off. And does the policy side think about that? I tell the story of of a piece we did on counter narcotics once, and it's probably about 5 years ago. And we'd written, it was a wonderful piece on counter narcotics. It was one of our longer pieces. It was looking out 4 or 5 years. And, one of our seniors when at CIA came into my office and lauded the paper and said, "This is fabulous." He said, but he said, what you essentially do, and he said, the analyst clearly knows this issue quite well. He said, but what you've basically said is country X is going to make some progress against counter narcotics, but not solve the problem. He said, so on a scale of 1 to 100, you've given the policymaker an assessment that says it's going to land somewhere between 5 and 98 on a scale of 100. And so you're not going to be wrong on it. But he said, if you're a policymaker, what you really want is to say, you're at 20. You can get to 30 pretty easily. To get to 35 or 40, here are the things you're going to have to think about and some of the options that you have and some of the trade-offs that might exist. You put more effort here or there. He said, if you get into that space, the analysis is much more relevant to the policymaker. And that's just a harder thing to do. And so what I would like to do is sort of raise the bar on it. So often when we talk about where we're right, I worry sometimes it's on something that it's either hard to be wrong, or that because we have so many people in the intelligence community writing on it, you can find places where we were righter than we were in other places, right? And what you want to have for the policy side is sort of an active discussion. Here's what we think, but when I write when I edit pieces for senior policymakers, what I want to capture in that piece is, here's what the assessment is, but there's a debate in the IC. Part of them think it's going this way, part of them think it's going that way, and here's why that matters, which one is right, and here are the drivers that can get you to those places. Those are more difficult pieces to write, but I think they're much more use to the policy side than something where everybody's just comfortable telling their story and being happy that they're not wrong in some way. So, I mean, in places where we get things right, I think a lot of things that we do, I would argue are, generally right in the sense. I think a lot of the counterterrorism work we do in terms of the threat, the way we see it, is generally right. I think a decade ago the intelligence community was talking about the Sahel. And are concerned about the ungoverned space in the Sahel and where that was going to be. I think we can look there. I think analyses going back a decade or more talk about the rise of China and the implications, and it was easy enough to look at models and the impact that was going to have. Even getting the nuance right, getting when have we shifted to some different model, there's more discussion and debate around that. But certainly looking at key trends and things that are really going to begin to impact us, I think we've been right on. I think on things like the rise of weapon systems out there, the ability of arms control to sort of manage all of this when there's a as technology improves and the cost of having things that allow you to take action beyond your borders drop substantially. I think the intelligence community has been ahead of things like that. So I think there's a range of political and economic things where I think we've gotten the trends right, indicated, and I think these, not unlike the academic community, identifying there's a growing risk of a problem here, figure out how best to manage it.
So I want to pick up on something that you said about how you can always be right if you say the probability is between like 5% and 98%, and maybe really that what matters is between 20 and 30%. And one of the advantages of some of the crowdsourced sorts of let's say of any probabilistic forecasting method is that it gives you an easier ability, why don't we say, to generate a number. Or generate a smaller range potentially than like 5. I mean, obviously like 5 to 90. It's an illustrative example. I get it, but these methods have been the research on this has been around for a little while now. There have been some attempts to institutionalize these platforms than the IC in the past that didn't work out quite as well. I'm encouraged, substantively, personally, to hear about the new efforts that you mentioned in your opening remarks. I wonder if you maybe share with us, given what you said, and that more precision in some ways could be helpful for policymakers. Why has it been hard to institutionalize some of those methods within the intelligence community?
Well, I think the paper that I read going into the conference laid out a lot of the challenges with it. I think understanding sort of what's being asked, figuring out ways in which getting someone to own it, all these things matter. I've tended to think over the years, though, that the issue is this: how much of an improvement does it offer? How consistent is that improvement? And is the effort worth whatever the cost is in terms of getting there? And I think that's where, when I've talked to analysts over the years about this, we use these things to understand, because we're always looking at approaches that challenge our underlying assumptions, that challenge our key conclusions, to understand why did people look at ostensibly the same basic set of data and come up with a very different assessment, right? And so understanding some of that is part of what we do. And so on Global Trends, Maria and team spent a lot of time working with trying to understand those sort of questions. But for the analyst, if you told them that we would have a couple things. One, we could improve your ability to forecast on this, they would be very interested in it. The questions they would have is, how much? Is it, is it a little bit, and how much work do I have to put in to getting it a little bit more? Because there are opportunity costs, right? The complaint in the intelligence community for most analysts is, I have a ton of things to do, from answering those turnaround taskers to something that I might want them to do, to my research that I'm doing, to trying to do outreach, et cetera. Now you want me to spend time on this. Why is this going to provide the value added that's worth doing it rather than some of these other things? And so I think there, and partly I think over the years it's been the ease of the process. I think that we're in a data-driven era where it's easier to understand some of these things. The approaches people take, I think, are more familiar as the workforce gets younger. It becomes something they're more familiar with. In terms of the engagement, on it, I think is easier. But I think in the end, it's going to have to be able to demonstrate that consistently, or relatively consistent, because no place is perfect, that it produces insight that, I really wouldn't have had if I hadn't done this. A little bit like when we went to structured analytic techniques. That was a struggle with the analysts as well.
That's a really interesting analogy.
Yeah, you had to sort of, in the office that I was running at the time, you had to mandate you have to do this. And so for every piece that you wrote that was coming up, every, more strategic piece, you had to demonstrate that you had used a structured technique. So we actually set up a group to work on, I think we had 4 or 5 different structured techniques. And then the methodologists, then, depending on what your analytic problem was, they would talk to you, but match a tool to what you were trying to do that would better fit what you were trying to accomplish. And what we found was it worked actually quite well. It was, a challenge in the first few months, but after a while, everybody sort of jumped into it. And the worst that you would get is a sense of, I didn't think it helped me very much. But for most people thought, actually it did help sharpen my thinking about, I didn't understand that really these were the 2 key assumptions, that if something happens to those, that my basic analytic framework is going to fall apart. So I need to focus more on those sort of things and understand that, my analysis is more subject to shifting, et cetera, as you go through. So I think in some places in the IC, it has worked pretty well. I think the same thing will be necessary here. There are analysts using this. There are analysts that are interested in it. And the hope is by setting up a group that's focused on this, that will be able to generate enough interest and demonstrate enough value, that you get more early adopters, as it were, if I can use that phrase at this point.
I think that's probably right. Yeah.
And once people see, in word of mouth that this actually produced, value added, I think it's quite possible we'll see some progress. But
well, that's great. Well, we have a lot of great questions coming in from the audience, and I wanna turn to some of those. I'll probably mix some of mine in too. And the first I want to ask is from Ian Lustig, who's a professor at Penn, who's done a lot of research on the intelligence community and forecasting over the years, and he asks about validation and verification, and that you talked in your remarks in your response to my questions about assessment techniques. And maybe you could spend a minute telling us about how you think about validation and verification techniques.
Well, I will have to say I'm an old school analyst, so I don't know if you mean how do we go back and see how we did.
That's what I think it means. Yeah,
that's what it means. There are a couple things that one does on it, and certainly on big issues. And certainly, as you indicated up front, in places where the intelligence community has gotten it wrong, we bring in outsiders, old IC professionals, to sort of take a look at it and provide a fairly robust look at what did we do right, what did we do wrong, what lessons learned. I think in places that, on going back to Iraq WMD, I think there was an effort underway to sort of look at what happened there, and then that those key results and those key insights were factored into IC training. So every new analyst coming in was sort of taught, here are some of the mistakes that were made, here are things you ought to be aware of, et cetera, as moving through. I think we generally encourage the analysts. What I would tell most of the analysts when I was a line manager and others is that, a lot of this has to be driven by a sort of rigorous look by yourself, because there's going to be a time when you're sitting there and you've written something for the president that day, and you're going and there didn't really get a lot, edited a lot, et cetera, and you're going to go home and you're going to think, I really have this. I demonstrated how great I was. I knocked this out in a day. It's fine. And we asked them to go back and look at, 3 months later, look at the pieces you've written. And what you're going to find usually is they don't seem as intelligent as you thought they did. You look at it and think, I could have framed it this way. That would have been better. And certainly if you look back 6 months or a year at things you wrote, and part of it is you're just smarter on an account a year later. You have new data, you have new frameworks, et cetera. But it's that understanding that you're getting smarter and then figuring out what you could have done better there, and then apply that to what you're writing now. Because the only thing I can tell you of what you're writing now is a year from now, when you look at this piece, you're going to think you should have done it better, that you could have been smarter at the way you framed it. You put too much emphasis on this or that issue. So how do you begin as an individual analyst? How do you begin to factor in, here are places where, I know from the way I do analysis that I'm generally, if not blind, then it's at least opaque in these sorts of areas. And how do I ensure that my analysis gets better there? So I think that what we do broadly is, when there are failures, we have people, come in, outside experts look, sort of a clear-eyed assessment of how we did, what we could have done better. A lot of those sort of things are factored into training moving forward. So when you're going through the continuous learning we have in the IC, there are training courses that raise these things, here are things that you should be thinking about as you move through it. I think there's an effort as pieces move through the system to have your managers who have generally more experience than you do in writing on it talk about sort of how do you think about a piece, right? What are the who's your audience? What is it they're focused on?
Thinking about the policymaker at the back end, kind of.
Yeah, I mean, if you're writing a piece, what is it? If you're writing on pick a topic from today's headlines, et cetera, and you write a piece that reads like it's in the New York Times, which I'm sure would be a wonderful piece, or do you assume that the senior policymakers have read the New York Times or the Washington Post, and so they understand that issue? Your job is to talk about something different. Your job is to help them think about whatever this is in a way that helps them to move forward, and that's something that we try inculcate, I think, in the analytic community, through the years in how you think about what your role is. It's not being right in the sense that you have a discussion about, I knew that the German election was going to be closely fought and that the day after it was likely going to be hard to figure out who was going to be the next chancellor candidate, right? That's an easy enough thing to do. I'm sure any number of newspapers around the world did that. I mean, the question in part is, to the extent that there's interest, what are the things you ought to be thinking about? What's the story you want to tell about that? What are the questions that might come up the day after that you'd think about, all right, I need to answer that next level. I know, from personal experience, what we wanted to do the day after, we're sitting there on Sunday, the day that we found bin Laden. And the SEAL team removed them. The piece we wanted to write for the next day was, here's how we leverage this and move forward, right? We didn't want to write a piece that says, okay, bin Laden's death is a blow to the, Al Qaeda and the like. Everybody knew that. It's what's the next story. And so how do you get ahead of that and think about framing that story? And so partly, I think the validation, the vetting and validation is a little bit hard. The other way we do it, to answer the professor's question, more fully, we get a lot of feedback from the policy side, and so they let us know how we're doing in sort of addressing the questions that they had, whether they find the products useful. But I do think that there's a robust effort to sort of look at sort of how we're doing. Talk about how we, in places where the analytic line seems stale, efforts where we need to refresh sort of how we think about it and how we're framing it, and then sort of how we inculcate lessons learned into training so that we are less prone perhaps to making those mistakes in the future.
So that's great. Our next question comes from the former head of the NIC, actually, Greg Treverton, who asks about open source intelligence. Says that open source has not traditionally been an emphasis area for the intelligence community, and meanwhile, private sector analysts like Bellingcat have developed what amounts to crowdsourcing in a different but impressive way. Are there, could you tell us a little bit about what kind of initiatives are going on in the intelligence community to do a better job exploiting, all the information that's publicly available now?
Yeah, the ODNI is leading an effort right now looking at open source efforts. I mean, I think I would agree with Greg on it that, there's probably more insight to be gained in the intelligence community from open source. I think as we look around the world, not just things like Bellingcat, my guess is that every Fortune 500 company has an open source, element in it that's leveraging, exploiting, collecting to better understand the environment they're working in. The intelligence community is going to need to better tap into that moving forward. And so I think that the challenge is figuring out a model, as he knows, that there's a lengthy sort of approach to open source collection, and I think we're going to need to change it. We've been going through a months-long process to come up with a couple of different models and ways forward. We are engaging with others to figure out, to sort of test whether these go as far as we need it to go, and then think about what does which is, at least improved, if not more radical approach to leveraging open source look like? And partly though it's a resource issue. I mean, I would argue that, as you look at open source, you can use it for a lot of different things. And it's a question also of how do you prioritize what you want out of the open source on it. And, do we think about, are we putting enough resources into it? Not just, do we need to bulk up in this space because we need to be able to A, to collect more, B, to understand more, but B, there are so many different areas where open source is relevant. I think that there are a number of places in the intelligence community that would love to have their own open source group with them to better understand the world and to leverage that. So I think it's, I think what we've found has been a more complex problem than we had thought coming into this.
So our next question comes from Julian Barnes of the New York Times. And he asks, the Biden administration has been fairly public about its tasking on intelligence questions, e.g. COVID origins, Russian interference, domestic terrorism, et cetera. Are these public taskings with public deadlines helpful to the work of mission integration, and thinking about your role in particular, or do they make things more complicated given that in each case there are at least some findings made public?
I think it depends on the question that we have. I think the main thing that we want to be able to do, and we're in the midst of looking at how the IC can be more transparent. And so, we have, there's no objection to the policy side asking questions and asking us to be more public about some of these things, as long as certainly the answers can be conveyed publicly without putting sources and methods at risk. And I think it is, as long as they are part of a broader effort by the IC to increase transparency about what we're doing. We've put out the unclassified key judgments of COVID-19 paper. I think we have a lengthier unclassified version that will be coming out, in the next, weeks. The unclassified NIE on climate change will be coming out in the next couple of weeks as well. And I think in general, we are looking for ways to, certainly with the NIC, publicize more of its work, at least the key judgments out there, so that people have a better sense of what is it we're doing, what is it we're focusing on, what are sort of the key judgments that we're coming out with, et cetera. Because I think you can engage in some of this discussion more often. And I tend to think there's value in the intelligence community being perceived, at least in some places, as being more transparent about the conclusions it's coming to. And the way we're thinking about issues. And so, look, is part and parcel. If the administration has questions that play into that, it's probably not a bad thing.
So I just want to pick up on the climate change piece that you mentioned, since we have another question from Simon Richter, who's another faculty member here at Penn, who says that climate modeling has to contend with a lot of uncertainty as we enter unknown territory, and thinking about things like ice melt in Antarctica. What tools does the intelligence community use to integrate, climate modeling and security concerns, and given the, your desire to make some things public aside, the inherently secret nature of sort of some of what you're doing, what does that mean then for on a topic like climate change for connections, say with with research communities, international institutions, and communities that are leading a lot of the scientific work on climate change?
In terms of whether they'll want to be associated with us, is that the?
Well, in terms of how do you work, how do you gain the benefits of those insights? I think less will they work with you, and more, how do you in a world where analysts might be biased toward internal sourcing, going back to the open source question, in a way, because having worked in the Defense Department and under there's the allure of the classified, but in a world where on a topic like climate change, where so much of the leading work is not TSSCI, how do you?
I think it's a mix of things. So I think that certainly on the climate change NIE, I mean, we start with, here are the assessments by public assessments, and to some extent looking out 40 years, or 20 years, you take a look at a few of these things, and we take them as, this is what they've said. We're not going to do our own work trying to come up with it. We'll certainly engage with a lot of the experts, out there, on sort of the issue. Now, on the integration side, the challenge becomes this. What I would like, for example, is to think about, because it's two parts. I would not like IC climate change analysis just to be focused on, is climate change occurring and what are the effects looking out? I would like the IC analysis to be focused more on, in part, and this gets to the more classified part, sort of how are people thinking about it? How are governments thinking about this as an issue? And some of this is unclassified as well. But to better integrate the insights by country experts, by people looking at, where are the things, what are the things that the US ought to do? How do we take sort of insights from, these assessments and models, and then apply those to challenges we're already facing in the classified world? If we're writing a piece on, over the next decade, this is going to be an increasing problem. If we take the climate models and say, actually, it's going to become a crisis in looking at this, the collection that we may have looking forward says, here's how people are looking at it, and they see it as rising to this level. Actually, from the climate models that are out there, it's going to this level. So that there's a misunderstanding of the depth of the problem. So it's providing that insight, looking at something where we say it's worse than the people working on this issue imagine. And so there's an opportunity for the United States to engage, on these sorts of issues, or that this will be more of a problem than we had previously assessed, because the solutions they're looking to are not going to solve the problem they're facing. And so it's integrating that sort of collection, that sort of analysis with what the expertise that's out there, in the open source, the academic work that's being done, and marrying them up to say. And so I'd like to move away from, there's a climate question, let me turn to the climate analyst to say, I need to bring the insight that the climate analysts have into some of the challenges that we're facing, in terms of looking at some of this contestation around the world, places where, we're seeing, growing difficulties as a result of climate, et cetera. So, or to understand better, right? Or, urban environments, as you look in Africa, generally urbanization is viewed as a good thing in terms of education and the like. If you have more people moving to cities, and, elements of them are going to face greater climate problems, and obviously you have trade-offs, and how do you look at a problem that's emerging and think, now, because a lot of what we do is looking out 5 years or 10 years or 20 years and saying, this is a problem that we seem to be headed for with whatever, moderate confidence, et cetera. Here are things you can try to begin to do about it now. Here's how you ought to be thinking about setting up structures to address that problem, whether it's working more with the UN, whether it's engaging more with the countries themselves, whether it's working with regional institutions, et cetera. How do you marry that up, give the policymaker a sense so they have time to be able to do something, think about it, and do something about it moving ahead?
Thanks. So we've had a lot of questions that get, we've talked a bunch about forecasting from the perspective of, all right, so here's a question. What are the different methods you could use to figure out whether it's happening or not? I have a bunch of questions that have kind of come in that get to, how you decide what to ask in the first place and where you decide to prioritize. And Mark Rosenberg, who's the CEO of GeoQuant, asks, given the wide range of geographies and topics the IC is evaluating in something like a daily brief, what methods do you use to facilitate a more sort of apples to apples comparison and thinking about sort of risk and impacts among those topics to help prioritize and track over time? And he adds, and I think he's right, just to be clear, that's one potential use of models and quantification to signal like, hey, you need to focus here as opposed to there.
No, look, I don't disagree. I mean, as we do sort of the daily things that we do, what the IC prides itself on being is that we cover the world, and so we like to think that every 2 weeks we've covered all of the key events out there. What we do, in our whether you're at CIA or DIA or INR in your daily publications, you cover broad swaths of the world. You cover it with a mix of tactical, this is what's going on now. You cover it with a strategic looks out 10 years that you've done research and you want to put the key judgments in, et cetera. And then what we tend to do is look at it and say, okay, over the space of what have we covered? What have we not covered? What needs an update? Because some of the tactical analysis suggests that strategic look that we did 4 months ago isn't holding. How do we need to change that? I mean, it gets to a question of how does the IC think about change? I mean, one of the things that we worry about is, if you were to read what we wrote every day on a subject, you might come away with the feeling that, that's been covered pretty well. It's very clear. I understand it, et cetera. If you're a policymaker and you're not reading it every day because you're busy, you're not in the country, you're doing other things, and you're only reading elements of it, say 3 days a week, well, maybe you've missed a few of those. Do they have the same understanding that you would have of what the IC analytic line is? And so how do we sort of refresh that line? And so partly it's talking early on and engaging with the policy side are what are the strategic things that we need to be covering, this year, and making certain that we're covering it. Part of it is engaging with the IC community, say that, look, the policy side may not know that this is a strategic issue that they need to be focused on. And how do we start writing those and putting those in the book as well? Because usually what we have, the IC, has the books, and we can write what we want to write in the sense that, CIA can determine what's in their book each day and the like. And so it's we get feedback in terms of the work that we're doing on the strategic side, from the policy side, and from the analysts themselves and from the managers in the IC looking at saying, I'm not comfortable with sort of where we are. I think, we're not capturing this story in a way that will really drives home the strategic impact that it may have, et cetera. So it's a mixture of sort of sitting down, talking about like NIEs, what are the NIEs we're writing this year, engaging with the policy side, what are the ones you need, which are the ones we have. And then on the daily publications in all the sort of lesser or shorter products that we have out there, SOCMs, NICMs, et cetera, are we looking at, the what we would call the program of analysis for the IC? We look at all the programs of analysis and are they covering the issues that we need to have covered as well? And then asking questions, are we doing enough on some of the emerging issues? One of the things that I think the global trends focus on is the growing number of transnational problems, whether it's the risk of pandemics, climate change, emerging or disruptive technologies, cyber, et cetera, where the IC as a whole is having to shift more resources to focus on those sort of threats than I think we've had. So in addition to having things like China, like Russia, like CT, et cetera, still be issues that we need to focus on, there's a whole range of things that are emerging that really are more of a challenge that we're having to put more time on. So it's it is really a, how do you capture all of that for senior customers moving ahead? So it's becoming a more contested space in terms of the what we need to get into the book each day.
Yeah, it's got to be a difficult challenge, and we've got about 7 minutes left or so. I want to shift to ask an allies and partners question, but one about IC assessment in a way, and that how how do you all think about working with allies and partners, not just, all right, can we, we share this information with Five Eyes, this information with Japan, but to sort of learn best practices from each other. I mean, I'm in some of the areas that I've been thinking about and working in, for example, the British have been real innovators with a crowd forecast platform called Cosmic Bazaar. Is that the kind of thing that you all, how do you all think about that when, after all, like, we're the United States, and so, we're the biggest, and, et cetera?
We engage a lot with our liaison partners on the analytics side in terms of thinking about the pieces that we ought to be writing, trying to get their insights. I think that we are going to be doing more in the years ahead, engaging with them to understand, to collaborating more, and trying to leverage what's out there. I mean, I would argue, in a place like London, they approach some of these challenges in different ways. When you look at their cyber efforts, for example, the private sector is much more engaged with them in terms of what they do than would be the case in the USIC. It's not something versus nothing, but it's a more integrated, robust way. When you talk to them, you hear things that we aren't thinking about doing. I mean, partly there are legal issues, et cetera, but partly it's just sort of the way that we've developed. I think when you go to the UK and engage with the variety of research institutes around Whitehall there, you find a lot of insights, and what you find is there's more engagement. You will more readily find people moving back and forth in some of these places because and go to some of their sessions and find British policymakers. So I think that there's insight to be gained from the approach in engaging partners. I think there's also insight into taking advantage of their experience on the ground. It may be that partner X can't cover the waterfront in terms of the analytic space that's there, but in 2 or 3 places they actually are quite expert. And it all gets back to that question of how do you stumble upon new ideas and new approaches that challenge the way you think, right? The value of engaging with a partner that's just going to tell you the same thing that you already know is fairly limited. The value of engaging with a partner that can tell you something different, or at least tell you a different conclusion and can explain why they've come to that is a much better discussion that we have. And also they're solving problems in different ways than we do, bringing in open source in different ways. As you indicated, in working on the Cosmic Bazaar model. I think there are lessons to be learned in terms of how are they finding it, what's the value they're seeing in it, what are the difficulties they've overcome. Are some of these things worth sharing? Maybe there's some value, sort of as we talk in this space, as we develop our own efforts to engage with partners. How do you think about these things, and is there value in partnering on some of these issues? So I think that there's a lot to be gained there. And, I think just in general that, it's part and parcel of having impact in the intelligence community is engaging with our liaison partners so we better understand and they better understand the way we think. So analysis better informs policymakers around the world.
So we've just got a couple minutes left, and we have a lot of Penn students in the audience, and we're at a university, and I think lots of Penn students and many of my students have joined the intelligence community over the years. And what advice would you give to students, young people out there thinking about pursuing a career in the intelligence community? Well, what attributes and aptitudes should they be thinking about in school? How should they think about trying to get involved?
Usually, I mean, the points that we make are a couple. One is you have to have good grades to get in. I think the main thing is passion about something you care about. we once hired somebody who, the grades were fine, but when they came in for the interview, they spent, in terms of some of these questions, they spent half their time talking about working in their dad's grocery store, and the value that they got from that and sort of the lessons they learned from it. And you came away thinking that here's an individual who, has a life outside of whatever it is their expertise field of expertise is empathetic, understands there's give and take, etc. It's oftentimes not the smartest person necessarily that we want. It's the person that's the most curious, because that's it's hard to make somebody curious, but once you have it, you're more willing to sort of try new things, experiment, think about different approaches, etc. You tend to be a more interesting person in terms of someone you can work with, etc. So I think curiosity matters a lot. I think good grades matter a lot. I think someone who wants to make a difference, right? As everybody in your audience knows, you can certainly make more money doing other things than coming to the IC. But we have these enormous challenges to the U.S., to the globe, et cetera. And, this is still usually the only place where you can come in to work as an analyst and write something for the President of the United States, or the Secretary of State, and help inform them and help their thinking on different things. And so I think that the intelligence community has sort of a unique mission there. And I think over the years, it's grown. The job that, when I walked in years ago, you could be, as an analyst, the notion was you'd go overseas maybe once in your career, and you looked around at what people did, and it was something. Now the breadth of the opportunities for IC analysts to engage, to travel the world, to work in war zones, to work in difficult spaces, to work challenging technical problems, to really have an impact in the way the U.S. thinks about some of the most difficult challenges facing our country is truly unique. And I look back over my 35, 36 years and think it's been just a fabulous time, full of interesting assignments, et cetera, and don't know why people wouldn't be interested. Now, both of them, truth in advertising, both of my children went in a different direction. They went into the private sector. But I think they're, at the end of your career, here, I think a lot of people are very, very pleased. It's you won't be bored.
So with that, we are just about out of time. So there she is. I want to invite our Deputy Director, LaShawn Jefferson, on to thank you, sir, and to close us out.
Thank you so much, Morgan and Mike, for this fascinating discussion and for taking the time to speak with us about forecasting, the U.S. intelligence community, and really the future of the world. It's clear from the discussion that intelligence forecasting is transforming the world and ideally making the world safer if genuine learning, adaptation, and growth can happen along the way. It's also clear that the case has to be continuously made for its utility and value add to analysts themselves who are balancing ever more numerous and complex competing demands, and to the broader public, including critical policymakers. And thank you to our audience for joining us for our first event of the 2021 Global Order Colloquium. I hope you'll join us tomorrow for our very exciting programs, Fighting for a Better Future with the former president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and after the fall, the future of America's role in the world with Ben Rhodes. Links to sign up for these conversations are in the chat. Please join us. As always, you can access a recording of this conversation on YouTube and on our channel. You can stay connected with Perry World House by joining our mailing list and following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. We'll drop links to all of those in the chat. Thank you all again for being with us here today. Be well and see you next time. Bye-bye.